The night Vincent Sorrento walked into the Marcello building, expecting to detonate a career and a reputation, he walked out in the company of three men who had just quietly switched sides. Nobody planned that outcome. Nobody, except the woman standing at the back of the room, who had spent exactly 3 years standing at the back of rooms and waiting. Her name is Rosa Calucci. She is Dante Marcello's bodyguard, and she has been there since the night Dante made a bet he was absolutely certain he would win. 3 years earlier, Dante Marcello had 12 men on his security detail and zero tolerance for what he called theatrical hires. When his consigliere, Marco, quietly placed Rose's file on the table, 8 years Army, 2 tours, 18 months with a private firm in Brussels, and every qualification score in the contractor program sitting at the top of the sheet, Dante had looked at the file, looked at Rosa, and made an announcement in front of the full table. 1 week, he said. She lasts 1 week, I'll keep her. He said it like a punchline. His men laughed, because that was the appropriate response when Dante Marcello spoke in that register. Rosa was 31 years old, 5'6", built with the kind of solid presence that made tailors nervous and people comfortable making assumptions. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her expression arranged into something that communicated nothing at all, and waited for someone to point her toward her post. That was 3 years ago. She never left. The first week, Dante made no effort to make it easy. He changed cars without notice, moved meetings to locations she hadn't cleared, restructured his schedule at midnight, and didn't bother to send word. It was a test. Not the kind he ran on his men, which involved loyalty under pressure or silence under questioning, but the particular kind of test a man runs when he doesn't understand something and isn't ready to admit it interests him. Rosa adapted without comment. She learned his movement patterns before he had consciously recognized that he had patterns. She began appearing in the correct position 30 seconds before he needed her, not through instruction, but through the same methodical terrain reading she had practiced in Kandahar. Quiet, systematic, focused on where the next threat would emerge from, rather than where the last one had been. By day 4, Dante had stopped trying to lose her. By day 6, he had stopped registering her presence as a variable. By day 7, he couldn't quite reconstruct the texture of a room without her in it, and that was the thing he decided not to examine. He paid her and said nothing. She accepted and said nothing. The week became a month, and the month became a rhythm. This is what John Bowlby, in his foundational work on attachment theory, identified as the nervous system's involuntary search for a stable presence when surrounded by environments of sustained threat. Dante Marcello, whether or not he would have chosen the language, had found his anchor. And, like most people who have found something they didn't know they needed, he made a sustained effort not to notice. But proximity doesn't build what they were building. That took 3 years of shared silence, and one night when the silence finally ran out of room to breathe. The months settled. Rosa stood at Dante's back at dinners, at warehouse meetings, at the kind of conversations held in rooms with no windows that nobody outside those rooms was supposed to know had occurred. She didn't offer opinions, she didn't speak unless addressed, but Dante, quietly and without intention, began to watch her. He noticed that she read a room 30 seconds before he finished reading it. He noticed that when her weight shifted slightly left, someone nearby deserved his attention. He noticed she drank her coffee black at 6 in the morning without ceremony, and that she kept a paperback, always different, always worn, in the inside pocket of her jacket. He never asked about the books. For 3 years, he wanted to. That was the part he filed under things he wasn't going to examine. They had built a private language out of glances and position, out of small nods and silences that carried more content than most people fit into a full sentence. Anyone observing from a distance would have called it professionalism. Anyone observing closely would have called it the specific tension of two people who have been not saying the same thing for so long it had acquired its own gravity. What neither of them said, across every room they stood in together, sat at the center of each of those rooms like something neither of them could move around without knowing exactly what they were moving around. Vincent Sorrento had been watching them for 6 months before he decided to use it. Sorrento was the kind of man who had converted every human relationship in his life into an instrument of leverage, not out of cruelty as a personality trait, but out of the specific, grinding fear of a man who had built something real from poverty and brilliance and was in constant, low-level terror of losing it. He'd grown up in East Harlem, earned his way into a Castellano partnership across 20 years of careful work, and had spent the last 2 watching his territorial margins erode steadily in the direction of Dante Marcello's operation. That fear had transformed into something predatory and methodical. He had studied the surveillance footage, he had read the patterns, and he had concluded that the one fixed constant in Dante Marcello's professional life, the one presence that had never moved from its position at his back, was the woman. He was going to make that the instrument. The Palmer House Charity Gala was neutral ground by tradition. Dante attended, Sorrento attended. 40 men with complicated histories smiled at one another across good wine and said nothing that would hold up in court. It was the kind of event where social architecture mattered more than conversation, and Sorrento understood social architecture the way engineers understand load-bearing walls. He found his moment at the bar. Rosa was standing 3 feet from Dante, running a slow scan of the room, when Sorrento materialized at her shoulder with 2 of his men and a smile arranged for an audience. "I have to ask," he said, at a volume calibrated precisely for the dozen people in immediate range, "is this a bodyguard or a catering order?" He paused, letting the air settle the way it does when someone has said something that the room isn't sure it has permission to laugh at. Some people laughed. No offense intended, truly. But Dante, if you're sending someone to protect you, maybe consider sending someone who can actually move through a doorway. The room did what rooms always do in these moments. Several people looked away. Several looked at Rosa. A handful produced the reflexive, uncomfortable smile of people who are grateful the target isn't them. Rosa did not move. She held Sorrento's gaze with the trained stillness of someone whose nervous system has been specifically conditioned to remain calibrated in environments designed to produce panic. Her hands stayed behind her back. Her breathing didn't change. She said nothing. Dante, half a conversation away, had heard every syllable. His hand around his glass had gone white at the knuckles. His jaw had set into something that wasn't quite expression. He did not move. He filed it. He waited. In her research on the social psychology of public degradation, Dr. Linda Hartling at the Stone Center documented what she called witnessed humiliation, the compounding mechanism by which public shaming in front of a social group inflicts damage far exceeding the content of the insult itself, because the audience becomes structurally embedded in the wound. Every face that watches the moment land becomes part of the memory. Sorrento had chosen the Palmer House Gala with the same precision a surgeon chooses an instrument. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had made one mistake. He was about to find out what it cost. For 3 weeks after the gala, the rhythm continued. Neither Dante nor Rosa raised it. The coffee, the positions, the books in her jacket, the language of small adjustments that meant more than either acknowledged. All of it continued without interruption. But something in the texture had shifted. Something had been admitted into the room that the room hadn't contained before. Dante's sleep worsened. In meetings, his attention moved sideways without permission. He was carrying something personal that had no operational outlet, and he had no practice in managing that specific weight. Rosa noticed. She noticed the way he held himself differently now in her presence, not distant, but careful, like someone moving around a word they're not ready to say yet. Then Sorrento made his real move. He sent word through the appropriate channels that he wanted a sit-down. Neutral ground, the Marcello building, in what appeared to be a gesture of good faith. He would come to Dante's house. He brought 3 associates and a leather folder and the expression of a man arriving at a negotiation he is confident he controls. The folder contained a fabricated intelligence file, assembled with considerable skill, designed to look like Rosa had been providing Sorrento's operation with information on Dante's movements for the past 18 months. False communications, false timestamps, false access logs. Plausible enough in a room full of men who would already be looking for reasons to be suspicious of the woman none of them had fully accepted. If the file landed on the table with Dante's capos watching, the truth of it wouldn't matter. The suspicion would be enough. Rosa had intercepted the intelligence 22 hours before the meeting. Through contacts she had maintained quietly across 3 years. Former military colleagues, a financial analyst from her time in Brussels, a woman inside Sorrento's bookkeeping operation who owed Rosa a debt that predated both of their current lives. She sat with the file for 40 minutes. She ran the forensic analysis herself. The metadata inconsistencies, the timestamp compression errors, the particular formatting signature of documents assembled under time pressure. Then she made 3 phone calls. What she assembled in the 12 hours that followed, no one in that building was going to be prepared for. Sorrento arrived at 7 in the evening. He greeted Dante with warmth. He settled into his chair. He positioned his leather folder on the table in front of him with the deliberate ease of a man placing a final card. He glanced at Rosa, standing at the back of the room, and the corner of his mouth did something small and satisfied. Dante opened the meeting. He listened to 90 seconds of preamble about shared interests and territorial resolution. Then he nodded once. Not at Sorrento, at Rosa. She walked forward and placed a folder on the table. 47 pages, spiral-bound, clean paper. She opened to the first page with the same economy of motion she applied to everything. "Before we discuss the proposal," she said, and it was the first time she had spoken directly to Sorrento since the gala, "there are some financial structures I'd like to walk through." She walked through them. 18 months of Sorrento's parallel operation, the Delaware shell accounts unknown to the Castellano family, the payments to 3 law enforcement contacts he believed were his protection, and the parallel payment stream from the federal task force that had been running those same contacts as informants for 11 months. Numbers, dates, account identifiers. 47 pages of the kind of documentation that doesn't leave room for interpretation. Robert Cialdini, in his foundational work on influence and persuasion, identified the moment of social proof collapse, the instant when the consensus reality a person has constructed publicly dissolves, and every person in the room who has been aligned with that person immediately recalculates their own position. Sorrento's 3 associates understood what those pages meant for their futures before Sorrento had finished reading the first one. The denial lasted about 80 seconds. Then the understanding moved across his face like something expensive breaking apart under pressure it was never designed to handle. Then came the particular silence of a man who has run out of moves in a room full of people who were watching him realize it. Dante stood. He spoke 4 sentences. They were sufficient. Sorrento left the building in the company of associates who had, in the past 40 minutes, made different arrangements. The leather folder sat on the table, unopened. Sorrento had never found the breath to reach for it. Rosa had removed all the available oxygen before he got the chance. The building emptied. The capos filed out. Dante stood at the window with his back to the room. Rosa moved through the space collecting documents, methodical and unhurried, not performing anything for an audience that was no longer there. Rosa. She stopped. He turned from the window and looked at her directly, without the practiced management of distance he had maintained for 3 years until it became structural. The file he brought, Dante said. You'll know what it contained. Yes. You had what you found 22 hours before this meeting. You could have used it to disappear. To protect yourself and be gone before any of this landed on you. Yes. The silence between them held its familiar weight, but something in it had changed its shape. Why didn't you? Rosa set the last folder down. She considered the answer with the same precision she brought to everything else, not as performance, but as actual thought. Because you needed to know what was true, she said. And because... She stopped, recalibrated, continued. 3 years is a long time to stand in someone's corner without saying why. The distance between them, maintained across every room and every silence and everything left unsaid, was simply no longer there. What John Gottman, after 4 decades studying human connection, called the turning toward, the small, repeated decision to face someone rather than away, had been happening in this room for 3 years, in a language neither of them had named. What happened next was only the moment it became impossible to keep pretending it wasn't. There's something about the loyalty that never asked to be noticed, that just kept showing up morning after morning in the only language it knew, that does something permanent to a person who's spent their whole life knowing the price of everything. If this story found you today, leave it a like and subscribe.